It's hard to.
Aren't a lot of buses
It's hard
now natural
to
gas?
think about
Yeah.
a science
Also, you don't want to make people wait in the cold.
Okay.
on a naturalistic basis.
What is excellent?
This is the
I mean,
This
you
is
could
the
say
gavel
chemistry
now.
doesn't have that many theistic implications or none, but chemistry itself requires a ton of fine tuning or you wouldn't have it. So,
okay.
There it is.
yeah,
All right. Hello, everybody.
There's somewhere.
exactly.
Hi. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Hey. All right. I'm gonna pound the duck again. Okay.
Need a bigger duck.
There we go. That's how we can call it. Yeah, that. Sorry to everybody's ears over there. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome. Glad you're all here. This is especially a good day because UTD was bumped off of the top 100 list of universities. No, I'm joking, but I don't know how it got there in the first place. Yeah. Anyway, I'm just kidding about that. We don't have anything big except Pancakes and Pontification comes up sooner than it usually does, which is the first Saturday of October. So just keep that in mind. That, huh?
All the bread French toast.
Yeah, with some caramel chips in it and blueberries. Yeah, all of that. We're going to mess around. It was a fun time last time. If you want to come and join us and talk about anything that you'd want to talk about with regard to apologetics, spirituality, that's a good thing to do. Also, was it in October or November that we were going to have another debate night? Anyway, there will be one also coming up pretty soon. Yeah, it would be in mid-October, I think, and then mid-November is our Thanksgiving stuff. Anyway, we got more information for this unapologetic conference in Saginaw that we might all go together to. It's on October 26th, and this code will make it free. So if anybody is interested, that's compliments of Eric Hernandez, by the way. He was very generous in handing that to us. So take a picture if you'd like to visit. This week we were going to have Justin Bass come and join us, talk about heresies and creeds, which is an excellent thing for us. But anyway, he's going to now be doing that on November the 19th, if I remember correctly. And thankfully we have, our director has a lot of instruction and apologetics up his sleeve, so he's going to talk about the evidential value of Acts tonight. So there we go. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Kenneth. Yeah, so this one is somewhat stolen from Dr. Tim McGrew. A few of you have, I think, heard McGrew speak here before, but he's a super knowledgeable scholar who's from Michigan. But he's been researching the evidence for Acts for like 10 years or so, at least at this point, probably 15. And he had a really good presentation, and I read some of the books that he referred to, and have added just a couple things here and there, and we'll try to make it understandable. But yeah, what we're going to look at does tie in, I think, with Kenneth's presentation, if you heard it early in the semester, where he talked about the way you can look at the Gospels and how they intersect with history. We're going to kind of apply that and look at the book of Acts. So yeah, the outline for today is to start off with a sort of the meta question of, well, why does this matter that much if you get historical details right? What does that prove or not prove? How significant is that? Ultimately, you want to know, is this inspired by God? And so we need to kind of talk through that. Then we'll jump into the actual evidence. As well, we'll look at a couple of objections from one of our favorite skeptics, Bart Ehrman. He is sort of one of the more knowledgeable scholars, so it's not like we're picking on some, internet guy that's just posting videos. He's a true scholar. So we'll look at some of his objections against the book of Acts and try to respond to those. And then if we have time, we'll talk about something called undesigned coincidences, which I'll explain when we get there. But I'd like to ask you guys to respond to this question before we jump in, and I offer a few thoughts. But why do you think historical accuracy matters for the books of the Bible? What's the relevance of that? Yeah, David.
The instant you doubt one book, its precedence to doubt the other books. So it's important to check historical accuracy for all the books.
Okay.
That way, when you do have to give a reason for testimony, then you have a reason for every single book, not just the Gospels.
Okay. Yeah. Any other thoughts on why is this relevant? Why are we talking about these kinds of topics? Caitlin.
It's really hard to get correct outside of the context.
Yeah. So the implication then being like, oh, well, maybe this wasn't written later. Like some people try to push the authorship to these later dates, and that could be problematic if you want to say, well, these were eyewitnesses and things like that. Yeah, that's good. Seth.
In the end, Christianity makes a truth claim about the past, that is, Jesus rose from the dead. And so if you're trying to argue Christianity, you have to argue that that was historical. And if there's a bunch of other things in the Gospels or the rest of the Bible that isn't historical, then it's going to be a lot harder to argue that was historical.
Yes. Okay. Well put. Good thoughts. So yeah, I mean, I think what you want to do in any religion is evaluate its claims, right? And our claims are pretty well documented in the Bible. And there are certain parts of it where maybe you can't check everywhere, right? If you're just quoting some speech by somebody, we don't have a recording of that. You can't check everything in the Bible. But if you see this pattern that, oh, everywhere where I can check the truthfulness for what it's saying, it's shown to actually match known history or archaeology, then I find that very significant and showing that, well, whoever wrote this gave great attention to detail and was reporting truthful things, not lying. There's a lot of implications, I think, from that. For example, one of the challenges skeptics sometimes bring against the Bible is the preservation of the text. We have a whole week later coming up fairly soon, actually, where we have an expert on that topic giving a talk. But if you know that, like if the text really was changed, if we don't know what even was originally written in Acts, then how could that be historically accurate? If it was changed over time, presumably those later scribes miscopying things or people making intentional changes would not preserve, especially what we're examining here, which are the incidental details, right? So when you go to, many of you here are Christians, not everybody probably, but when you hear in church people talking about the book of Acts, you know, they're going to be talking about some of these amazing stories of healings or the gospel being preached. This is going to be kind of the opposite. We're going to look at the verses as just like flyby territory where it's talking about, you know, specific places and things going on. And we're going to check that and show that actually, to an amazing extent, we can actually show that it's very accurate in all those details. And so I think there are implications about when it was written, who it was written by, whether it was changed either legendarily or, you know, sloppy copying. All those kind of issues come into play. Now, some like Bart Ehrman, he would try to say something which doesn't make any sense. Tim McGrew is an expert epistemologist. This means the study of knowledge. He's written a lot of peer-reviewed articles on that, and he points out that it's not fair to say that, oh, if you found a mistake in a writing, that counts against that being a truthful account. Okay, if that's true, then the converse is also true, where if it's shown to be accurate, then that's at least some supporting evidence for that being a truthful account. That's kind of just common sense, but some people actually try to dispute that. All right. Yeah, and the thing that we're going to get into here, many of these details, some of them are more commonly known, but the vast majority of everything we're going to talk about tonight are these incidental details that would not be known, for example, to someone living in the area of Israel. You know, these are travels throughout the Mediterranean, or if you lived in Rome, you would not know much about these various places. So these are things that are hard to get right unless you were actually there. Okay, now Acts in particular is significant because what did the author of Acts also write? The Gospel of Luke, right? So that has implications. If this author is shown to be accurate there, then he's probably also going to be accurate in Luke. Now, we do have independent evidence, some of which Kenneth talked to, I think, but we can show that Luke, where you can check it, the gospel is also pretty accurate, very accurate for everywhere that we can check it. One of the unique things about Acts, though, is that it intersects with so many different places, and there's a very dense amount of material where you can test it. And so that's one of the reasons it's quite interesting to look at in detail. And obviously, this is a very key thing, right? It does tie into the resurrection. This is when the resurrection was first preached, when the early church grew. We have 4 gospels, but we only have one account of the early church and how that expanded throughout the Roman Empire and so forth. So this is very significant in that sense. Now we can compare it to other religions. Again, I'm going to open it up to you guys. What do you think about other religions and what they write historically? Are they able to, do they even make historical claims in all cases?
Most of them are completely absent of real historical claims. I mean,
A lot of them, yeah.
Even Islam. It's, you know, Muhammad was a real person, but
Sure.
but the teachings that derive from him are not rooted anywhere in history. Where Christianity, if it's absent, if you take all the historical stuff out of it, then if that's shown to be false, then we fall apart.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's the same point kind of that Seth was making for that aspect. Yeah, even in the Quran, actually, it reports some things about Mecca that don't seem to quite fit in terms of olive trees and the level of vegetation. And the first references historically to Mecca come much later. The first biography about Muhammad came also a lot later than the first biography about Jesus. So there is a distinct difference.
It is what you would expect for somebody. It is what you expect to get if somebody made it up. You know, we talk about that when it comes to the New Testament. That this isn't what you would expect if somebody made it up. Most religions, it is exactly what you would expect if
Yeah.
somebody made it up.
Yeah, the notion of religion starting from being crucified. Your leader was crucified. That's really bizarre. And even like Richard Dawkins has mocked Christianity for wearing crucifixes, but it was such a transformational event. That's why it happened. You're going to say, Rob? Exactly. Yeah, we would find that so crazy, right? But all right, we'll talk just real briefly about Mormonism as one of the weaker religions. Other religions aren't quite as bad off, but so even like at BYU, which is Mormon owned, of course, they'll admit things like they can't really fit. It's suppose it's recording a lot of things that happen in North America historically, before Columbus, things like that. But they mention all these place names and a battle happened here, but they can't find artifacts there. They have to admit they really haven't found the kind of historical confirmation you would expect if these things really happen. And so it stands in a very distinct contrast to what you'll see in the book of Acts, even though Acts is taking place a lot longer ago than some of this anyway. So yeah, they're even admitting, there is no such thing basically as Mormon archaeology and that it's a myth. There's absolutely no archaeological evidence you can tie directly to events that took place. And that's even just BYU people admitting that. The Smithsonian Institute, there's a lot of, how many of y'all have been to the Smithsonian? They have a lot of cool historical stuff, science stuff, but they have scholars there studying things, including history, and they use the Bible sometimes to get information about history, to know where to look for artifacts. But they say about the Book of Mormon that even though there's all these sources claiming it, they've not been substantiated by archaeological findings. Whereas about the Bible, they mention that they're accurate historical documents, more accurate than many of the Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Greek histories. They can and are used as ancient documents in archaeological work. So that stands in significant contrast. So let's look at some connections between Acts and historical records. Start off with just a couple things here. One is the list of names. I pulled this from Frank Turek, where he lists all the names in the New Testament and that they've been verified outside of the Bible. And there's a bunch of them from the book of Acts, as you can see here. So that's pretty cool. And then you can also look at, for example, the great archaeologist William Ramsay. He started off skeptical about Acts as a non-believer. He just kind of assumed it's like other religious works, that it's going to be full of errors and just made up stories. But he said that even though he began with a mind unfavorable to it, he came to say that Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. His history is unsurpassed in respect to its trustworthiness. So pretty high praise there from a top scholar. Another one, A.N. Sherwin White, a Roman historian, he says, for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long since taken it for granted. So let's look at some of the evidence, though, to see if, why do they say this? We're not just going to give you an appeal to authority here. We're going to actually look at the evidence. So again, the blue slides here you'll see are basically taken with minimal editing from Dr. McGrew and sometimes made more concise. He says he's only listing about a third of the examples he could. And I've trimmed it down a little bit to fit in our time slot here. So Acts is authenticated in multiple ways with these kind of external confirmations and by the undesigned coincidences I mentioned before. There's also a number of internal things that match. For example, the epistles, the letters of Paul, match really well, like a hand in glove with the book of Acts. And we'll talk some about that. All right. So especially once you get to chapter 13, that's where you have Paul and Silas taking the first missionary journey. And you have a number of these missionary journeys. They're traveling around the Roman Empire. And so you have a lot of details mentioned at all these various places. And so I think you have to kind of keep in mind, for us today, if we're writing a story about some other country, it's actually fairly easy, easier than it's ever been in all history, right? We can get on Wikipedia, we can use Google Maps, we can do all kinds of things. But you have to remember, this is 1st century AD. There weren't even very many books that talked about other places. You could find a few books in libraries where it would talk about, visit the great places like Rome or these really well-known cities. But you wouldn't find them writing anything at all about these minor little cities where Paul traveled preaching the gospel. Okay, so there's really no way to get the information other than just go there. You could get a little bit maybe from talking, for example, to sailors or something like that. But it'd be very likely that you would make mistakes if someone just made up these stories, which is actually what Bart Ehrman claims. He claims that Luke didn't even go with Paul on the journey, even though you have these so famous we passages where Luke says, all of a sudden in the text, it goes from talking in the third person to first person. He says, we went to so-and-so, and so it's obvious that he took part in some of these journeys. So let's start with some of the geographical and political type things. You've got a lot of overland routes, cities, landmarks, political boundaries mentioned. Let me ask you guys this. So do y'all even know, for example, there's not every state calls their counties counties. Do you guys happen to know any counterexamples to that? Louisiana has parishes, very good. That's a neighboring state, so a lot of us might know that. Good. Yeah, they have boroughs. So, and like if you think about Spain, what do they call their highest level subdivisions? Yes, that's pretty good actually. Better than I could pronounce it. So, all right. One example that's kind of interesting is that for a long time they thought Luke made a mistake in saying that that Iconium was in Phrygia rather than Laconia. So there's kind of these different provinces, and they changed the boundaries at one point in time. So most all the writers would say Iconium was in like Lycaonia. Okay, but it turned out at the very narrow time window when Luke is writing, we now have inscriptions showing that, oh, well, at that time, Phrygia was surrounding the city of Iconium. So Luke was shown to be true and the skeptics wrong. And you got a number of those things that have happened over time. Okay, so Philippi, we all know about the book of Philippians probably as this well-known Roman colony. But what you probably wouldn't know unless you were there, named Neapolis, and that's testified in both manuscripts and coin evidence. And then like when they're traveling in what is modern day Turkey and Galatia, you can see as it lists the cities they're going to, they're all, you know, if it's, sometimes it'll give it to you and say one day they were here, the next day they were there. And if you look at the mileage, it's often about 30 miles, which would be a day's journey. So that matches up. The order of approach to these well-known Cilician gates. The cool thing about a lot of this too is you can go there, you know, some of these things you can still see today. I went in August of year before last to Greece and Turkey. I was able to go to Ephesus and see a lot of cool things there, and also see a lot in Athens. Some of the places mentioned in the book of Acts, like the Areopagus and so forth, Mars Hill. So yeah, you've got those kind of details confirmed. There's a small river. Those are less well known generally near Philippi, the Gengetes. These locations, as I mentioned, like some of them are the right distance apart. So successive nights on the journey to Thessalonica, it makes perfect sense the way that's recorded. Sea routes and landmarks. There's a natural crossing between correctly named ports. Mount Cassius, which is south of Seleucia, is within sight of Cyprus. So you probably wouldn't know that unless you've actually sailed there. The proper port for a ship crossing from Cyprus would be Perga. But if you returned, you would use Italia, which is kind of interesting. It was more of a coasting port. They would go to intercept a coasting vessel in that area. So there's a lot of just real little details that would be hard to get right. If you're writing it later, or you're writing it from somewhere else, or you really didn't go there. You know, yeah, maybe a few of these you could talk to people and get information, but I think it becomes implausible to posit that somebody could get all this information and get it so consistently right if they weren't writing early and if it wasn't more of an eyewitness kind of account. The correct implication that sea travel is the most convenient way of reaching Athens from Berea. If you're in the summer, you have these Etesian winds coming north to south that would make it very easy to get there. Whereas in the winter, which was not the time they took this trip, that's not what you would want to do. The winds would not be favorable for that. There's a very conspicuous sailor's landmark, an island called Samothrace. It's dominated by a 5,000-foot mountain, shown here. So you could see why you would want to use that as a landmark when you're navigating and you don't have GPS and so forth. Actually, that's an interesting question. We have some evidence from Acts itself that he was not a sailor. There's somebody that wrote a book, and he did a lot of research. He was a sailor himself. He talked to a lot of sailors in the Mediterranean, and he said you can find out, if you study Acts carefully, you can see two things are true. One, it's an eyewitness account. You see Luke explaining things that make sense and fit. But two, that he wasn't a sailor. Like when he talks about putting out the anchor from the back of the boat, that's very unusual, but he doesn't try to give an explanation, like you normally would if you were a sailor. You would explain, well, in this situation with these big waves, we needed to do it this way. So there's a lot of interesting things that have been analyzed in that regard, actually, where you can kind of see that he was a physician by trade, as most of you know. So he wasn't one that would just travel around. He really had no reason to until he went with Paul on these journeys. All right, also, there's a lot of local customs and beliefs that you encounter as you're reading through the book of Acts that are kind of interesting. When Paul went to Athens, you see him debating the Athenian philosophers and talking about how they love to just talk philosophy all day long. And we know historically, that was very much what was happening in Athens in that particular time frame. They would go to the agora and have these kind of debates very regularly. And also when he says, he's preaching the resurrection there, and you might think, well, wait a minute, the Greeks, they believe in all these gods and all these miracles. They probably believe in the resurrection, right? Plato believed in the immortality of the soul, but they did not believe in bodily resurrection, actually. So the fact that they were skeptical towards Paul's preaching of that fits very well, as can be seen in this play by Aeschylus, the poet, where he talks about, once you're dead, there's no return kind of thing. The Ephesians theater, we saw sort of a recreation of that in Ephesus. There was just a few stones left, I think, from the original, but we have inscriptional evidence dating the fact that this was the meeting place of the city. So when it talks about how they would go there for just general meetings, that's confirmed historically. There's also a lot with respect to local languages, dialects, terminology that you see in the book of Acts. The name of Lystra is highly unusual, but again, Luke nails that, gets that correct. Most of the areas they traveled were Hellenized. The Greeks, after Alexander the Great, 350 years ago or so, conquered. The Greek became very much the language of these regions. But interestingly, when they were in Lystra, it mentions that they were speaking the Laconian language. And we know from history that, in fact, that was one of the rare places where Greek was not predominant. So, yeah, there's a lot of details like that as well. The form of the name Troas, if you look in later writings, by the 2nd century, they used a different spelling, different pronunciation, apparently for the city of Troas, but the 1st century version is exactly correct by Luke. When they, we were talking about Paul, talking about the resurrection, they're skeptical. They called him a seed picker, spermologos, and that was a known slang term used in that area. And they talk about the Areopagus, the court, the Hill of Ares in Acts 17. All of those are also historically confirmed. Now in Ephesus, they have this long history of worshiping this goddess Artemis. And you might remember some of the issues there with when people were being converted, and they were having trouble selling these idols, they found a lot of these terracotta versions of this goddess in Ephesus. And anyway, so we very much know that everything that Luke is talking about with regard to Ephesus and their obsession with the great goddess Artemis is confirmed historically as well. The term Hatheos is the formal designation of the goddess, as can be seen in the Salutaris document. Now also there's a number of ethnic identities mentioned in the book of Acts. Won't even try to pronounce this, but the word they use for Berean is very precise, attested to by local inscriptions. The employment of a characteristic ethnic term, Asianos, which means a Greek in Asia, was also what was used in that area. And local religious practices. You might remember that it was Paul and Barnabas, they were preaching, and the people were like, oh, you guys are like gods, and they were going to worship them as Zeus and Hermes. And those were actually the local gods of that particular area, as we can confirm from inscriptions that have been found in Lystra. So a lot of little details like that. Pretty interesting. It doesn't sound like a made-up story. The abundant presence of images in Athens, including the altar to the unknown God. We have at least some attribution of that later. We don't have it nailed down to the 1st century specifically in Athens, but we do in some other places. So the fact that Paul makes this reference to temples made with hands and this unknown God altar definitely fit in that area of Athens. the shrines and images of Artemis that we were just talking about. We have that as well. You'll also see a number of synagogues mentioned. There was a time where some skeptics said, oh, these synagogues come later. These Christians are just making it up. It shows they wrote it later. But then later they found various synagogues earlier and earlier and have come to realize it's actually, we can pretty much, verify the various synagogues mentioned in the New Testament, including, for example, like this is not in Acts, but the one in Capernaum was supposedly especially glorious, and we have evidence now of that. But as far as the ones in Acts, we have the one in Thessalonica, in Athens, and in Corinth. So that's kind of cool that you've got, hard stones, confirming some of the things written about there. That's kind of hard to fake in a way that could fool archaeologists. It's not as though Christians made a fake synagogue later or something, right? That would be preposterous. One of the interesting things is the titles of local officials. So just as, not every county, not every state in the US calls them counties, you have some variety of local officials' names. Well, you really have that in spades in the first century in the Mediterranean area. All these different areas use different terms for who is your main political leader of this locality. And we have Luke getting that right every single time. So in Philippi, you have magistrates, and you have politarchs instead of magistrates in Thessalonica. So had he been sloppy and kind of forgotten, and just wrote those backwards, they would both be wrong. It would make no sense based on what we know from outside the Bible. The Areopagites as a correct title for a member of the court in Athens. We actually have Gallio. He was a proconsul in Corinth, and these were generally one-year terms. And we have an inscription from him, and it's dated to the exact time of the book of Acts. It fits well with the time frame that you see there. I think in this case, there's a little bit of uncertainty about the book of Acts timing, but it's not much. And this actually helps calibrate the whole book against history, to where then when you check other things, it matches up exactly with what's known historically. So that's pretty cool. This is just a sampling, but there's a lot of other examples as well. Grammateus is the chief executive magistrate in Ephesus. We found that in inscriptions. The proper title of honor, Neocorus, as a temple keeper, is shown in Acts 19:35. And yeah, one of the great things about Tim McGrew is he generally has references here where you could find these if you're so inclined. I actually did bring some of the books that I got as per his recommendation. If anybody wants to peruse them later, it's really quite interesting. We'll talk, I have these listed later, but one of them in particular, Tim and Lydia McGrew helped get the publisher to republish. And so I got a copy. The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. The whole thing is just listing, it's by Colin Hamer. He's listing kind of verse by verse the ways that Acts intersects with history. And if you just kind of even peruse it, you kind of get the idea like, wow, it's pretty dense. There is a lot more examples that I'm listing here in the verbiage. So feel free to look at that. Here's another kind of summary one. And here's one on the archaeology. I've kind of marked the part that talks about Acts. So anyone's welcome to check those out later. So yeah, we talked about, let's see, the last one here, the proper term for the assises. I'm probably saying that wrong. Those holding the court under the proconsul. So again, these are probably flyover territory. You might not even remember seeing some of these as you read through Acts, right? But they're significant. They're there for a reason to show the historical accuracy. I think everything that we have in our Bible was inspired by God, and it's profitable for teaching and so forth, but it's also profitable for showing that it's true, which is really cool. So I think, yeah, the main point here is that it's getting details right that would not be commonly known. They could not be looked up. There's no Wikipedia. There's no libraries where you could just go and get books to get this kind of information. So things we haven't mentioned that are also here are like local industries, proper nautical terminology, a lot of the details associated with the voyage and shipwreck of Paul. Yeah.
Is there any reason why most of what has been mentioned here is between chapters like 13 and 19, and we don't have much yet outside of that?
There is some. It's just that 13 through 19, when they're taking all these journeys. I mean, you do have, a lot of the other ones. It's like Acts 2. He's preaching. You have people coming from other places. There's probably a little bit there just showing the accurate references of people that would come for Passover. But you have them interacting a lot more locally. But as they were fulfilling the Great Commission and going beyond Judea, that's where you really start getting a lot of more opportunities. But there are some, actually.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm reminded how much the activity is within those.
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, yeah, there's some positive evidence, but there's always two sides, right? People argue against this too, and we should look at what they're saying and examine it honestly and see if it has merit. I think in this case, anyone honestly looking at the evidence, as even secular people who are archaeologists or historians would admit, it's like, well, this really seems accurate. But Bart Ehrman, he's known for also writing these popular level books that get a lot of money, and he tries to go against the traditional Christian viewpoints in many different areas. So he claims that Luke is more interested in spinning a good yarn than he is in preserving a historically accurate narrative. And he tries to draw some contradictions between the account in Luke 24 of Jesus ascending to heaven after his resurrection and what you see in Acts 1. We'll talk about that. And he claims that whenever Acts relates an incident from Paul's life that Paul himself discusses, there's striking and irreconcilable differences. I think this also, to any honest inquirer, is shown to be spectacularly false. And there's whole books written on, William Paley, for example, has 40 different documented interlockings between the book of Acts and just the first 4 epistles of Paul. So, and Lydia McGrew has a good book, Hidden in Plain View, that gets into some of these, that I'd also recommend. I can loan you all a copy of that if you didn't. Some of you may have bought it when Tim was here from him, or we might have handed some out, I forget. So here's the claim from Ehrman in Luke 24. He says, in Luke 24, you can read it for yourself and see, Jesus rises from the dead, and on that day meets with his disciples, and then again that day he ascends to heaven from the town of Bethany. But when you read Acts 1, written by the same author, you will find that Jesus did not ascend on that day or at that place. So the first thing you want to do when you see a skeptic make a claim like that is what? Yes, absolutely. And in this case, we'll see what you guys think. Okay. Let's see. I think this is still quoting Ehrman here. Jesus instead spends 40, this is where he's talking about Acts 1 and what it says in contrast, he claims, to Luke 24. Jesus instead spends 40 days with his disciples, proving to them that he's been raised from the dead. It's not clear why he would have to prove it, let alone do so for 40 days. And then, only then, 40 days after the resurrection, does he ascend. Here he ascends not from Bethany, but from Jerusalem. Luke tells the same story twice in 2 radically different ways. Historical accuracy does not appear to be his major concern. All right, so let's look at these texts. Okay, Luke 24 doesn't actually give you any time indicators at all. It doesn't say all this happened on one day. All right. Now it does sort of, I'll admit this, it does use this principle that some scholars call telescoping, a lot of ancient authors used, where and a lot of people think actually the book of Luke is so long that it would have barely fit on one scroll. And they think there might have been this pragmatic sense in which Luke had very little space left on the scroll to finish his gospel. And so he was a bit brief. He didn't want to insert, well, this happened this day and this happened another day. It's just all there together. But there's no claim that it's all one day. It doesn't give you really any kind of indicators of day at all. Okay, so I'd give Ehrman a D on that claim. I mean, you could try to make it into something, but that's debatable. Very weak. All right, yeah, so McGrew lists several other ancient authors that use the same kind of rhetorical technique. I think I've mentioned this before, but you really have to think about how they're writing in the first century, right? You want to be brief because everything's hand copied. Okay, you got to put it in a scroll. There's not this luxury that we have today where you're just typing in your editor on a computer, right? And then you can just send it off in an email. It's like, no, it actually costs a lot to write, and it takes a lot of time to copy. And so there's a motivation to be brief unless there's some really compelling reason to insert information from that. Yeah, Mike.
What percentage of the population could actually read and write like
They think it's pretty low, actually. And Ehrman himself likes to make much of that, like, oh, there weren't many people that were literate, therefore the Bible couldn't have been written by the disciples or something like that. Not recognizing that, well, they would have a motivation, even if they didn't learn it when they were young. Some of them, at least, might want to learn it so that they could record it. And if you've seen like The Chosen, it's very plausible that the more educated former tax collector Matthew would write things down or things like that.
And Ehrman doesn't give a lot of credence to the biggest element of this, and that it was an oral culture.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay. So the percentage is small in what they read, but you also have people with extraordinary memories,
Yeah.
and can recount things just by the listening. This is a lot of people remember Paul's letters just by a community reading, and they could tell you what was said. So their comprehension was,
Yeah. In particular, the people following Jesus as rabbi,
yes.
I mean, there's this very strong, like, you just lock on to his words, and you have a community memory, right? Maybe one of the 12 forgot some of the details, but you're constantly reinforcing it as you talk about it over time. And yeah, there's actually, you can go modern day today, there's parts of Africa that still have oral cultures, and their ability to remember things would put all of us to shame incredibly. They're able to recount these very long stories and things like that and get it right. Because it is different, right? We've lost that in our modern, we don't have to remember things as well in our modern age. So
I mean, how many of you can recite at least 4 phone numbers that you have in your phone?
3.
Well, I mean, okay, some of you exceptionals.
y'all are smarter than the average person too,
But
probably.
most people
Yeah.
count to one of those 5.
One of them is 911. Yeah. All right, now let's look at this one. I think Ehrman gets an F on this one. If you look at the location of the ascension, so, okay, yeah, it is true in Luke 24, he says that it was from Bethany that it happened. But in Acts 1, it only says about Jerusalem, not that it happened there, but that they returned to Jerusalem. So where does Ehrman get off saying that the ascension happened in Jerusalem in Acts 1? He's totally off there. And in fact, if you look at a map, it does talk about it being, by the Mount of Olives. So as you see here, Bethany, there's one of 2 possible locations. Modern scholars aren't sure which location is correct, but both of them are near. This is a big mountain, right? It's like this whole area is a mountain. Both of those are associated with the Mount of Olives. So to say that Jesus ascended from the Mount of Olives and then they returned to Jerusalem, it totally fits, right? And you got a lot of gumption anyway, saying that one author was inconsistent with himself. You got to think that a lot of times it's more likely that you're misinterpreting something. But here, I don't see how Ehrman could possibly have misinterpreted anything. So we're calling his bluff on that one.
Well, and how does Luke start out both his gospel and the book of Acts? Right, that he is recording an orderly account to somebody. So he's not just writing this to record it for his own pontification.
Yeah.
Right? He's telling somebody And being a physician, the details are going to matter, right?
Yep,
Writing
absolutely.
the orderly account.
All right, now let's look at the second Ehrman claim, irreconcilable differences. So yeah, I think we've already kind of read this, that he's saying that you find these huge differences between the two. Let's just look at one of them for sake of time. Acts 17, 1 Thessalonians 3. Did Paul come to Athens alone or in the company of Timothy? He's wanting to claim a contradiction here in saying Acts 17 is clear and unambiguous. When Paul traveled to bring the gospel to Athens, he came by himself without Timothy or any of the other disciples. But Paul himself is also clear and unambiguous in 1 Thessalonians 3. We learned that he came to Athens precisely in the company of Timothy, not by himself. It couldn't be both. So again, the first thing you want to do here is check what he's saying. 1 Thessalonians 3 actually says, with respect to Timothy, that, okay, when we could bear it no longer, we're willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker, to exhort you, blah, blah, blah. He does not say how he arrived in Athens. All the passage tells us is that Timothy was with him at some point in Athens, right? It doesn't, you read the whole book and you don't see him saying that, oh, when he first came to Athens, Timothy was with him. He just made that up. And Acts 17 actually says, the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. So Acts expressly reports that a message was sent back urging Timothy to join Paul as soon as possible. According to 1 Thessalonians 3, Timothy was in Athens shortly thereafter. Where's the contradiction, right? He really wanted him to come. He was there eventually. It didn't make a claim that there was no contradiction in terms of the initial state of Paul being with Timothy and without. All right, let's talk even about an interesting aspect of how these lock together as sort of a so-called undesigned coincidence. Even within Acts, there's no report of Timothy's coming to Paul in Athens in response to Paul's command. We learn later in Acts 18 that he comes to Paul in Corinth from Macedonia. So even within Acts, there's a sequence of events narrated that leaves a gap. One best filled by the supposition that Timothy did come to Paul in Athens, just as Paul had urged, and was later sent back up to Macedonia, which is north of there, from whence he rejoins Paul in Corinth. So actually, if you really think about it, it fits together like you would expect if these are two true things being talked about. So really, if you look through the whole book, as McGrew has a lot more details on other claims of Ehrman, you see that he's either distorting one text or the other and trying to claim these contradictions between Acts and the epistles of Paul. So there are other examples of these kind of interlockings. This puzzle analogy is sometimes used for these. These are places where the text of Acts and some passage in one of the Pauline epistles or letters interlock in a way that's unlikely to arise by mere fiction or simple copying. So like even in secular history, people have used this term undesigned coincidences as a way of showing things to be historically accurate. For example, in World War II, there was a case where the Japanese documented that they saw some guy in a boat off in the distance, but that's all it said. But then you later also have a diary of a pilot who had been shot down that day, and he was in that location in his boat. And so those two, like he saw a boat from his raft or whatever. And so you see from both sides what they would have seen, and it fits together. And you have the same kind of thing happening in spades in much of the New Testament across these books that were written independently. And again, there's whole books written on this. Hidden in Plain View would be one of the best ones I would recommend on this if you want to dive in deeply. But we'll talk about just maybe one example here, and then we'll close it out. So in 2 Corinthians, there's this, Paul's writing to the church at Corinth. He says, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need as some do letters of recommendation to you or from you? Okay, there's no context there really given on, well, what do you mean, what letter of recommendation? Because presumably the Church of Corinth knows what he's talking about, so he doesn't really explain it. But you do get some insight from Acts. And it says, and when he, referring to Apollos, wished to cross to Achaia, Corinth is the capital of Achaia, the brothers encouraged him, and he wrote the disciples to welcome them. Okay, so Paul came first to Corinth, and then Apollos came, but they didn't know Apollos, and so he needed this kind of letter of recommendation. Okay, so you see that a little bit in these other writings. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, they had some division going on, and Paul is kind of telling them, don't do this. You guys are saying, some of you are saying you're a follower of Paul, and some are saying I follow Apollos. And he's saying you really need to follow Christ, not either one of us. And he explains, I planted, Apollos watered, but God causes the growth. So obviously the one who plants was there first, and then Apollos came and he watered, he helped the church grow some more. Yeah?
Does this really count as an undesign coincidence that it's within the same text? Like these are presumably a few paragraphs apart, right?
Well, these are tying, though, into 2 Corinthians and Acts as the point. Now, you could say, well, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians are probably written by the same person. But still, if you look at it in its totality with Acts, it really makes a lot of sense. And it looks like someone's not just trying to be clever in designing this to make it look historical, something which probably wouldn't have helped the early church get off the ground to kind of make up these things that most people don't even notice, until they're pointed out much later. And in our modern era, we can easily look up, go to these places and study them in detail. All right, so good question, though. Let's move on. There's some other examples that we could get to. This one, well, let's mention this one. This one's kind of cool. All right. Okay, in 1 Corinthians 4, it says, that is why I sent you Timothy. Okay, so Timothy had already been sent at the time that he's writing this to the church of Corinth, right? But interestingly, by the last chapter of this same letter, he says, when Timothy comes. Okay, so they've already received the letter before Timothy, but Timothy was sent first. That's a little bit weird, right? There's no explanation given in 1 Corinthians for why that would be the case. But we must infer that Timothy would have taken some kind of indirect route to Corinth relative to how the letter would have arrived there. But only in Acts 19 do we see that he did take such a route, going up and around through Macedonia, as can be seen here. So in order to get to Corinth, he goes this predominantly land route, but it's known that ancient male, they would often just take this short path across the Mediterranean there to deliver the letter. So, all right. So what are some of the reasons why all this is significant? Again, let's reiterate some aspects of that. The fact that Luke and Acts come from the same author, and so that has a bearing on the historical accuracy or the trustworthiness of the Gospel of Luke. And we have good evidence that Luke really was the companion of Paul. He would have written this early. Paul died in 63. People like Ehrman like to say, oh, Acts wasn't written until maybe 85 or something, but there's no way you could get all that right. It just makes a lot more sense to posit that, no, this guy Luke really was there with him, and he was recording this very accurately, and that it didn't change over time much because it's still shown to be accurate today. So really, I think we can see that Luke is a meticulous historian with firsthand knowledge, and that gives us more confidence in areas of his text that we can't necessarily check. Again, if there was some kind of copying error in legendary development, you'd probably be most likely to make mistakes in these little incidental details, right? The spelling of names of cities and what they called these, different political rulers in some cities. That's the flyover territory, right? But those things we know are right today through our modern knowledge, looking back on history, things that you wouldn't even have known a couple hundred years ago. And we do see in Acts and the Gospels this kind of thematic unity as well. Each gospel ends with the empty tomb or the resurrection, and the resurrection's a central theme in Acts. That's what's being proclaimed, as well as in the epistles. So I think we can say that the book of Acts is fantastically well supported by evidence of all kinds. Historical and geographical details verified by secular documents, archaeology, coins, maps, as well as internal connections, which we didn't have much time to get into, but it passes the test there as well. And so that does afford some support, additional support to the Gospels, and in addition to what we can see directly there as well. And here are some of the references that Tim would recommend, and I have two of these here, and I've mentioned Hidden in Plain View. So yeah, check these out afterwards if you want to. In particular, this Hemer one is very scholarly, detailed, with lots of references. What I don't have here would have been too big to carry are the commentaries of the Book of Acts by Craig Keener. So he's trying to also document a lot of the historical connections. And it's 7,000 pages. So there's a lot of details there. All right, so let's close it off there and see if you guys have any questions or comments. Yeah?
I thought it was interesting, just from the historicity of it, that it didn't just answer one question, but it answered who, what, when, where, why, and how. It wasn't just one dimensional.
Yeah.
It answered all those questions.
Yeah, it's really packed in with a lot of information, a lot of things that you can check. Seth.
I was going to kind of build on what you were saying at the end there about like the dating.
Okay.
Of it. Like you also have to consider the fact that Acts ends very strangely. Like
It's very abrupt.
Very abrupt.
Yeah.
I mean, you have Paul in Rome awaiting trial basically, and then that's just it.
Yeah.
So it really does seem to be that Acts ended there because there wasn't any more of the story left to tell, i.e., it hadn't happened yet.
Yeah.
And at least Paul seems to, it gives no indication that Paul is dead at the end of
That's right.
Acts, which would be really strange given that that occurred in 64 or 65. I just looked it up, and that would be anyone trying to make some kind of claim that Acts was written after 64 or 65, much less 85. You
Yeah.
have to contend with the fact that it ends abruptly like that for absolutely no reason at all, and does not mention Paul's death or James either.
Yeah, those are excellent points, Seth, actually. Thanks for mentioning those. Rob.
This is going to be a very minor point, but you scroll back to the slide on the Smithsonian on the historicity of Acts. I'm having a hard time finding the same source on Google, and I wanted to like make a mark of it. And if it's not the Smithsonian, that might explain a few things. But it was like compared with the Book of Mormon, so really close to the beginning.
Yeah, I think like these quotes, is that what you're looking for?
We can't see
Your
it.
screen is on the.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. I'm not in the mode, right? Yeah.
And the next one that talked about.
Yeah, I can track those down for you. I think I got them from an article, bethinking.org, but it listed references in that. So let's see. Yeah, come to me afterwards, and I can give you something where you'll be able to see that. And it's been a while. I generally try to track down the original from that. I can't remember if I did for that one or not. But all right. Any other questions or comments? Or all right. What are the plans tonight again?
Yeah. We're going to go to
Brahms.
Brahms, and I always forget to mention this, but we have T-shirts back there. If you have $10 and you'd like a T-shirt, They are available. We also have a bunch of business cards back there in that box. So, and those please do take and keep them in your wallet or whatever, so that if anybody wants to, if you ever get into an apologetic conversation with somebody, you can say, hey, I have the organization that you might want to come and visit.
Or yeah, just give them out proactively or
Yeah, I
something.
think
or
those are good to have.
put 'em on a
and
bulletin
give
board.
out and stuff. So thank you all for being here, as always. Yeah, and round of applause for
Thank you.
Buy a T-shirt. I have it on good authority, and by that I mean myself. That black is the color for this fall.
I did see in the Times there was a "Why do people wear all black all the time" article recently.
I was going to say, black was the color for between 5 and 10 p.m. yesterday.